So it's 3:30, so let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today with me and Ashley. Primarily, it'll be Ashley leading this amazing webinar. I'm just so excited that Ashley is here. She was one of our first students when PACE opened the ABA program, and now full circle, Ashley
Yeah.
got her BCBA, and here she is leading this amazing webinar. So Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So my name is Ashley Morris. I'll be presenting today on supporting students with challenging behaviors in the educational setting. I think it's just an important topic, especially if you work in schools or don't work in schools, because you support students that work in schools, right? So I think it's just better to have like a context of what happens in schools on the daily to support students. Make sure. I just want to do a quick introduction about myself. So I've been in education for over 10 years. I'm currently a special education administrator. So I oversee an autism program for our public school district. I've been a special education administrator for the past 6 years. Prior to that, I was a school psychologist. And so my role as a school psychologist is assessing students to see if they're eligible for special education services in the school district. And I think that so I did assessments. I also did counseling, and I think like 10 out of 10, that was like my best job, my most favorite job I had, because I really got to help students make progress in the educational setting. And you think about where are the gaps and how can you close them with a team. And so I think it was just really rewarding. And as Sunny shared, I do have my BCBA, and so I do think as well that this is full circle. I think that I wouldn't have my BCBA without Sunny. So thank you so much. She was a huge support. She did all my coursework and then just helped me through the process when I was taking my exam. And so I'm just really fortunate to support this community because it was so good to me. So what we're going to talk about today, I was telling Sunny, I'm like, there's so many topics within the topic of supporting students in special education, but I would like to focus on like understanding the challenging behaviors. So what are challenging behaviors considered in our school, like in a school setting? And then what's the impact that they can have on the students' progress within the setting? And then a systematic approach. So we're going to go over two approaches. So there are approaches to address behaviors for students that are in the general education setting. And then there's also like an approach that we would focus for students that have an IEP and qualify for special education services. So I think that we both target them in a systematic approach, but there's two different pathways. And then lastly, I think the biggest part of working in schools is collaborating with others. So I think that we don't do anything alone. Everyone brings their own level of expertise. And so it's important that we are working together as a team so that we're supporting the whole child and trying to meet those needs collectively. So we're going to jump into understanding challenging behaviors. So first, let's just describe what is behavior, right? So behavior is anything an individual says or does. Sorry, my office is right by the street, so you guys might hear the background noise. And then behavior is the observable and measurable act of an individual. It is learned. It is a form of communication to us. So we always think about what is the student trying to tell me, communicate, what needs do they want to have met, especially for students that don't have the ability to communicate through oral language, or they don't have a means such as like an AAC device to communicate to us. So I have students, like I said, in the autism program. And some of them have an AAC device, some use PECs, some have oral language. And so we're sometimes trying to fill in the gaps or trying to guess what they're saying if they're not able to communicate. So we're saying, what is their behavior sharing to us? And then behavior is influenced by the environment. So we always want to look at what's in our environment. How can we make changes to help the students be more successful? And then when we're looking at or describing a challenging behaviors are persistent actions that negatively affect the student's learning. It could be their social interactions or their safety in the educational setting. These behaviors, as I mentioned earlier, they communicate unmet needs and they require systematic understanding rather than us having a reactive response. And some of the common manifestations, it could be defiance, aggression, disruption, of student withdrawing, avoidance of a specific staff member, a task, where they're refusing to participate or engage in an activity. And then we want to think about what are the underlying needs, right? So what does the student need from us as the adults? So Are they communicating a frustration, an avoidance to something, a fear, a trauma response? I think that in schools, we have little people that have gone through some really traumatic situations that even as an adult, I'm like, I can't comprehend or even imagine going through that. And so we want to make sure that we also have a trauma informed response so that we're considering what they have gone through and how does that impact them. So really as forming relationships with students, like so making sure that they feel safe, they feel secure, that they have this adult in their life that is able to support them, that they can come to with no judgment. And so we really try to repair the harm in the educational setting the best that we can through relationships. And then also we're going to talk about a skills deficit. So is it something that the student cannot do, or are they choosing not to do it, or not unable to do it? And then, so behavior, like I shared earlier, is communication. So we want to know what the student is trying to communicate to us, what needs is the student attempting to meet. Maybe you're all aware about the functions of behavior, but it is our expectation that we are trying to pinpoint through data collection and through assessment what are the behaviors feeding. So then we know how to determine what replacement behavior we need to teach that student. So are they sensory seeking in the sense of they're trying to gain a desired sensory experience or avoid an unpleasant one, right? So are they in behavior because their parent put socks on them and they absolutely hate socks. So every time they come to school with a sock on, it's causing some unpleasant sensory activity and they really are just trying to make that stop. And then also escape and avoidance. So are they trying to get out of a situation, task, or demand? For example, does a student hate writing task? And every time we put a writing task in front of them, then they will demonstrate some type of unpleasant behavior because they want to avoid that task or activity, or to gain attention, right? So does the student want attention from others, which can be positive or negative? So even if the teacher is reprimanding that student, we're still reinforcing that behavior that that child did before the teacher reprimanded the child because we're still giving attention to that behavior. And then thus we're reinforcing and continuing the cycle. And then tangible, do they just want access to a desired activity or item? So for example, does a student really want the Chromebook or the iPad? And so they're in behaviors because they don't want to do the work, but they really want to get the activity that they desire. Or do they rather play with the toys and the blocks rather than engage in academic tasks? And then we always want to understand the context and circumstances surrounding that behavior. So are we, where does the behavior occur the most? Is it in class or is it on the playground? When does it occur? Does it occur before lunch? Does it occur after lunch? A student being hangry, just like adults, is a real thing. Could it be that the child is hungry and so we need to build in some snack breaks before lunch because by the time lunch comes, it's too far gone and they're already upset. So then we have to think about also with whom do the behaviors occur? It's very real that they might have a better relationship with one adult versus another, or with one adult can remind them of something, and we're thinking about a trauma-informed response may look like someone in their past. So then we have to work through that relationship as well, because it might be that that adult triggers more of the behaviors than someone else, or how that adult speaks to them may trigger that behavior than their classroom teacher, who has a more softer and nurturing approach rather than someone having a more firm and demanding approach. So we try to think through those scenarios and all of those factors to try to determine how we can build an intervention plan for that student, and then what we can do to make the tweaks or the adjustments within the school setting. And then I wanted to talk about a skills deficit versus a performance deficit. So we think about it as a can't do versus a won't do. And I really think that this is so important when we're talking about students or just learning a new skill, and does someone actually have the ability to generalize a skill that they've mastered. So when we're thinking about a skills deficit is something that someone cannot do. It's the student has not learned or lacks the ability to perform that expected behavior. And this is because there's a lack of opportunity to learn it or practice that skill. And so as an intervention that we would implement would be targeted, explicit in teaching or modeling of that new skill so that we can have continuous repetition until the child masters that skill. And one of the examples could be a student does not know how to properly ask for help, So we need to teach them what the expectation is around asking for help. I gave another example of a TK student not knowing how to sit on the carpet appropriately during whole group instruction. And you might think like that sounds so simple, like you just sit down, cross your legs, and sit on the carpet. But I'm not sure if you guys are aware of what's called Universal TK. That is in California, where students are able to come to school and be in TK at the age of 4. So we're allowing students to come in younger and younger, but then no one taught them these skills of like being in the school setting. We call them school readiness skills, like being able to sit, wait your turn, raise your hand. Those are all things that teachers are now learning that they have to teach. They can't have the expectation that they have to come. So I really feel like the TKers and the kindergarten students, because TK and kindergarten are not mandatory, but they are rocking our teachers' worlds. Like regardless of what district you work in, they are like having the hardest time with that age group. And it's because they have to literally, they can't teach ABCs, they can't teach math or numbers or reading until they teach those behavior expectations. So they're really having to delay teaching content because they have to focus on teaching behavior expectations. So I think for me, that's like the perfect example of a skills deficit, because really those kids aren't coming to school and like running around your classroom to upset you. They legitimately don't know what you want from them when you say sit down. Like, do you want me to sit down on the carpet, the chair, the couch? Like, there's so many seating arrangements. Like, where do you want me to sit and what does that look like? And so that's something that we're working with teams and our educators to start teaching, and like explicitly, like I want you to sit with your legs crossed and your hands to yourself. We're even encouraging that they have carpet and everyone has like their assigned area, like taping little boxes so they know that they keep their hands and their feet in their box so they're not touching each other when they're on the carpet. And then regarding performance deficit, that's the won't do. So the student has the skill, but does not consistently utilize the skill. So it could be a lack of motivation, it could be environmental issues, or even the reinforcers that we were using are no longer working. So then we need to change our reinforcers to make sure that we're supporting for the students finding meaning in that. Right. So, like I said, the intervention would be adjusting the reinforcers. We could change the reinforcement schedule. So maybe we're not also reinforcing quick enough. And then addressing the motivation piece. Like they need to have intrinsic motivation. So that's like something that they find within themselves, the meaning or the value in what they're doing. Because, for example, if I'm like, I'm going to do my homework every time my mom, because I like that my mom says, good job, Ashley. But then the next time that she doesn't say good job, I do my homework, she doesn't tell me good job. And then I do my homework the next day and she doesn't tell me good job. It's like, why do I keep doing my homework? Because she's not complimenting me. She's not reinforcing me. So then it's losing its value and my motivation to do it because I'm not getting the praise that I desired. So then we have to think about how do we shift those reinforcers to help the student also find meaning in it. So an example I said is a student can complete a writing task. So they have the ability, there's no deficit in their ability to write tasks, but every time the task is too long or they feel like it's too challenging, they just won't do it. So then one way that we could shift the requirement or the expectation is that if they feel like it's too long, we break it up and chunk it. So rather than write the 5-paragraph essay, I want you to write 2 paragraphs today. You can write 2 paragraphs tomorrow, and you can write 1 paragraph the next day. So the teacher can be able to chunk the assignment so that it's not one big daunting task at one time. So we try to think about ways that we can make it more manageable or easier, right, for the student to chew and understand and desire to do it. Or if we're saying motivation piece, it's like, I don't really want to write an essay about I don't know, like the history of America, but I would really like to write an essay on, how people build cars. It's like at the end of the day, if they're writing the essay, right, and we're determining the skill, maybe we can work with the student to gain buy-in about the content or the topic that they're writing about. And so I would like you guys to think about in what ways do you feel or do you know that challenging behaviors can impact a student's progress in the educational setting? I think you all have access to the chat. So I just like to see if you guys can just share some ideas or thoughts on like if a student had challenging behaviors every day, what impact would that have on their educational progress?
I mean, I can share, and
Yeah.
if anyone else wants to put in the chat, go please feel free. But right, in what ways can challenging behaviors impact a student's progress in the education? I'll say, well, they're just not learning.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, sometimes when I work with kids with challenging behaviors, they're outside the classroom the whole day. And I'm in these meetings where, oh, he's maybe in class for 5 minutes and then he's spending the next 5 hours outside roaming around. They're oftentimes separated from peers, so it's also impacting their ability to not only get an education, but also socializing with peers.
Yes.
Sometimes other peers don't then want to interact with the student who has a challenging behaviors because of previous history of maybe getting hurt, things like that.
Yeah.
Their focus is on behavior management rather than educational progress, inability to have access to the full curriculum.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think a lot of the points that you touched on, and also the ones that are in the chat, that they are losing on their academic content. So, if you're outside every day for math, you're missing out on the content for math. So your skills in that area are going to, of course, decrease. And then we're also thinking about the relationship with peers, because whether we are doing it intentionally or not, right? That creates stigma when you're like, that child always gets sent to the principal's office, or that child's always sent outside. So then it does impact their ability to form friendships, being labeled as the bad student. That happens every day, right? Whether we're saying it out loud, we are expressing these things non-verbally that are putting stigmas or stereotypes on others. And so regardless of, or in addition to the academic impact, there are some big social impacts that are also impacting students in this setting, especially when they are having these daily challenging behaviors. So one of the things that I was thinking about when I was making this slide is the educational impact, right? That challenging behaviors significantly reduce instructional time, academic progress, and the overall classroom learning of all students, not just the student that is impacted with the challenging behavior, but their classmates, right? So if Tom has a tantrum or a challenging behavior and is like throwing stuff in the classroom and flips the desk over, the teacher has to stop teaching for everyone to address Tom's behavior, not just Tom is the only one that's losing out on instructional time. And then other areas that are impacted are the academic achievement, right? So the grades, their interactions with peer, engagement in school. Like school doesn't become fun when every day you're having to go to the principal or you're getting yelled at because of how you're behaving, or even your school attendance, because sometimes you're suspended so you can't come to school, so then that just further decreases your wanting to be there, your ability to be there, and that goes into suspensions and expulsion rate, because students that have increased challenging behaviors are often the ones that are suspended or having put up for expulsion, right? So then their ability to even go to their home school and have relationships with the kids that are in their community, if they get expelled from a site, they have to go to another school that might not be in their community. And then as well as our graduation rate. So students' ability to graduate, they probably will drop out if they can have persistent behaviors that are not treated or supported. And then the overrepresentation in special education. So being a special education administrator, you see how commonly students with behavioral needs, staff are asking for them to be assessed to determine if they have a disability, because those students are sometimes placed in other classes. So they're not in general education all the time. They might be put in a smaller class setting. So then their ability to interact and have time with their general education peers also decreases when they're put in another setting. And the law always does say that students shouldn't be placed in special education because of behavior. But time and time again, we see that's why they're referred for special education, because they're like, because the gap or the educational impact is demonstrating itself with those challenging behaviors. So then they're now having academic needs. So it's just a cycle that contributes to each other. And then I also added staff retention. So every day as a staff and teachers, you come and every day is a fresh start. But if you're like, I had to deal with this student all day and it doesn't feel good, they yell at me, they curse at me, and I don't enjoy teaching. It's hard for teachers to want to stay in these combative situations all the time and not feel, and they also don't feel supported always. And so that burnout is very real, where educators may look for other pathways or for careers, because that job is hard. So it's a very hard job teaching in general, but then having to teach and work through with a student in the challenging behavior, sometimes you do feel isolated if you don't feel like you have support from other team members. And so the impact of challenging behaviors, I just wanted to go into it in more depth in these four areas. So academic achievement. So students with persistent behavior challenges often demonstrate significant behaviors such as defiance or aggression are strongly linked to long-term academic underachievement. And that would be with test scores. That could also be with benchmark testing when we do that, or when we do the state testing, as well as their grades. And then attendance. Students with behavioral challenges are at increased risk for chronic absenteeism. And technically, you only have to miss 2 days per week to be on track to be, or sorry, 2 days per month to be on track for chronic absenteeism. So for the state, so they say like a total of about 18, if you're doing 18 days, right, for the year, you're considered chronically absent. So if you're chronically absent, then they do like what's called a SART process, where you're going to have meetings at the site level. Then they have a meeting where you're going to court with your parent, and just all of those things that contribute to it's supposed to be a supportive process, but it doesn't always feel supportive. You're like, you're taking me to court, right, about my child. So I even think for parents, like how that is it's not an inviting process. It doesn't feel good that you're going to court because your child misses school. And so just thinking about how small amount of time that students can miss to be considered chronically absent, if it's like just 2 days per month, that's concerning, because imagine if you have behaviors every day, you're probably being sent home early. You're probably not coming to school every day, weekly, for making it the full 5 days. So we have to think also as educators how we contribute to students being chronically absent by our response to their behaviors. And then regarding suspensions and expulsions, so again, students with identified behavior needs, especially those with disabilities, are suspended or expelled at more than double the rate of their peers without any identified behavioral challenge. And then regarding to graduation and dropout rates, so students with identified behavior challenges are 2.5 times more likely to drop out of high school than their peers, and only 60% of them with identified emotional or behavioral disorders earn a diploma, compared to 85% of students overall. And if you think about the ability to earn a diploma, how many doors close to you when you don't have a diploma? Because even to work at McDonald's, they're now requiring that you have a high school diploma. So if you don't have one, we're closing their access, right, to be able to have life after high school or going to college, right? They can't really, you can probably go to a community college and take some classes, but they still need to earn their GED. So we're just thinking about how our decisions now impact their futures, and how their decisions now impact their futures as well. So next, we're going to go into two different approaches. Like I mentioned, we're going to talk about the general education pathway of like how we would address behaviors. It's called multi-tiered system of support. So I don't know if you have experience working in schools, but it started off as RTI, which was response to intervention. And so response to intervention evolved into multi-tiered systems of supports, where we call it MTSS. In schools, there's a lot of acronyms. They all mean little different things. So if I ever say one that you don't know, please put in the chat so I can help clarify. But MTSS is an educational framework used by schools to identify and support students with academic, behavioral, or social emotional needs. It is a proactive, systematic, and data-based approach that provides different levels of support, from universal to targeted interventions for students. So the idea is that there are interventions at all three tiers. So tier 1 is supposed to be universal supports. So all students have access to tier 1 interventions in the school setting. Tier 2 is targeted. So that's where we'll try to do like small group intervention, and for students that are considered to be at risk. And then intensive supports, which is tier 3, we focus more on an individualized. So if you see on the diagram that's on my right, it's the one where it says tier 1 is 80%. So the idea is that 80% of the students of the supports in tier 1 should support at least 80% of the students in that population, of your whole school population. So it should be good enough for the majority of your school population. And then 15% of the students would need about a more intensive support through group intervention. It could be mentoring. They would need something in addition to that. And then at the 5%, which is tier three, so it should be a small population, need additional support that's more intensive. So I'm going to go into some of what those supports can look like in a couple slides, but that's the idea of MTSS. So you're supposed to, usually at tier one, they have like counselors or any support staff. So it could be school social workers. They usually have them put out like a screener. So they screen the students to see if they have any, whether the students personally might have any feelings of any social emotional needs or red flags that might be popping up where that child might need additional support or additional care. You also could look at discipline referral. So how many times does the student get referred to the principal's office or the dean if you have a dean or the counselor for some type of behavioral infraction? So the students that have the most infractions, they might be considered moved up to tier two. So you would look at who is responding to your universal interventions and who's not, and then you would move those students up to tier two interventions. The students that aren't responding at tier two, you would move them up to more intensive interventions and they would be in tier three. So I'm going to go over just some more detail about MTSS and the different tiers. So in tier one, all students, it could be whole group or small group, but that's where we're focusing on like explicit teaching of our core curriculum or the core instructional supports at our school. So that would just be like our classroom rules or our school rules, as well as differentiated instruction. So what the teachers are already doing in their classroom. So we're really not asking anyone to do anything extra. It's just like you do what you're doing and you're hoping with that net you catch majority of the students. In tier two, it should only capture some of the students, as I previously said. And then we're looking at those students that are either below benchmark or having some more behavioral needs with like in referrals or behavior infractions. And then we want to also offer during this time reteaching of the rules that are already in place or targeting a specific skill. So for example, if a student is having peer interactions that are poor and they're not really having good friendships, maybe we would target a group around social skills. So how to form relationships, how do you deal with conflict, how do you speak to others when you're upset, how do you advocate for yourself when you're frustrated, do you need to take a break before you can join in back on the group. So we would have like specialized groups to focus on the needs that we're seeing. And then for tier three, it should be fewer students and that the students should be able to have more individualized intervention. So it's explicitly based off their individualized needs. And then we want to be able to keep in mind that students, when they get to tier three, they can still have access to the interventions at tier two and tier one. So even though you're moving up to another tier, the school rules and all of the incentives that the school is doing for tier one, those should still be offered and available to a student once they're in tier three. So I made this graph to kind of give an idea of supports that I have seen in the school setting for the different tiers of MTSS. So for tier one, like I shared, that would be like school-wide routines and expectations. I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard of PBIS, but that's Positive Behavior Incentive Programs. So usually that's a school, for example, they'll set 3 rules for the whole school. So like in LAUSD, they're really big on 3 rules, which is be safe, be responsible, and be respectful. So at each grade level, for each developmental level, they break down what it looks like to be safe, respectful, and responsible. So for example, for a first grade class, they might say the classes together will make up their rules of like observationally, what does that look like? What's observable when I'm being safe? What does that look like? And so being safe could be like I'm in my assigned area. When I'm being respectful, I keep my hands and my feet to myself. When I am being responsible, I'm doing my classroom work. And then they will break down those 3 rules all the way up to high school. So then they have every site has the same 3 rules for the whole school. So then when you're outside, they might try these like incentive tickets. So they might be like, if the school's mascot is a cougar, they're like, these are cougar dollars, and students can earn these dollars to buy something at the like the snack stand on Fridays. So then if you're ever out as an adult, you'll say, I saw this student being safe, I gave them a cougar dollar. Or the teacher in their classroom can give them these dollars for them being nice to their classmate. So it's being reinforced throughout the whole campus, and everyone is expected to follow the same 3 rules. So that's called basically a idea of PBIS. So that would be a universal support, because that's covering the whole campus. And so again, like even classroom rules or classroom social contracts. So even as teachers within their classroom, they can make social contracts to say, in our class, we are, when we say we're respectful to other students, we don't talk when others are listening. Together, the class makes up the rules that they want their community to follow. So that's a way for teachers to get buy-in with the classroom rules, because they're like, we develop these rules as a classroom. And then they sometimes have each student sign the paper. So they're saying like, we are putting our signature, we all agree to it, we're all gonna follow these rules, because it gives the idea that we're a community and that we support each other, kind of like a family, like we're all here to support one another. In regards to tier 2, so that's targeted supports. That's for short-term individual or group counseling is something that we would see. Social skills groups, check-in, check-out. So check-in, check-out is like, for example, if you do have a dean or you do have a counselor, the student will check in with a preferred adult in the morning and like go over what are the expectations for the day. They may have some type of check sheet where each teacher, that student will go to each teacher if it's like middle school or high school, and the teacher will write a comment about their day and may give them like say a star. And so then at the check-in, the counselor or the dean will tell the student, you're going to take this sheet around to all your teachers. At the end of the day, they're going to write about you. And if you have 6 classes and you earn 5 stars, then I will give you a Taco Bell gift card at the end of the day. So it's being able to have some type of expectation setting at the beginning of the day. And at the end of the day, they come back to that counselor to review what the comments are from that staff member or from each teacher. And then did they meet their goal? And if they met their goal, then they get that incentive. So it's just another pair of eyes being able to work with that student and giving them some type of individualized expectation, but also holding them accountable. And then mentoring programs. So that could be like a women's empowerment group. So for students that are female students that are feel like not engaged or disconnected, they may do some type of an empowerment group for female students. At one of the high schools I worked at was in South LA. And so they had a group that would come in, a community-based organization, and it was called See a Man, Be a Man, and it was for African American males. And so they would just talk about what are they up against in the community as African American males? How do they feel at school? Do they feel welcome? Do they feel supported? And then really trying to help form those relationships, but talk about issues that really pertain to their own perspective or as an African American student. And so then they would help them just like review their grades. They would talk about, did they get sent to the principal's office? Like any behaviors, they would talk it through with that mentor to see about just like, what do you need from me and how can I support you? Do you want me to talk to your teacher? So really just having someone else advocate for them, but trying to build that partnership that they have more adults in their lives that care about their progress and care about their success. So then also there's sometimes you'll see like admin will do behavior contracts with students. So saying they might set a term that for a month, for the next maybe like 3 weeks or a month, they won't have no more than like 2 referrals per week. And so then if they meet their behavior contract, then there would be some type of a consequence, positive or negative, based off of their meeting their contract or not. And then for the individualized intensive support, so tier 3. So usually I would say at tier 3, we see a lot of referrals out to community agencies for counseling. So it could be free counseling. It could be counseling if the family, for example, has Medi-Cal or if they have insurance. The school districts will partner them up with an agency. It could be like Olive Crest or D.D. Hirsch. They all have different names, but they do the same work where they're providing counseling to the student, which could be individual counseling. They can also do group counseling groups at the school site, or they can go to a clinic, and then family counseling. So I think this is where you would also see if there's like ever any environmental needs or family issues. Like the mom's like, he doesn't listen to me either. Like I'm telling him to come to school and he doesn't come to school. So then it's like maybe that parent might benefit from a parent partner. So someone to work with that parent to see how they can help them set those expectations and have follow through. Also, if they're having a hard time, we also will offer the parent counseling too. Wraparound support is kind of that same idea. So it would be a group, usually it's social workers, and they will come into the home and work with the family. So they'll work with the parents if there's a sibling that also has an issue, and then the target student from our site. They would talk to the whole family about what are the challenges in this household, and then try to link them up to different community agencies. A lot of their support is helping students get to school. So if we have a student that's chronically absent and they just are not at school, they pair them up with some type of wraparound team. So they'll talk about like what the parents' concerns are about their attendance or what the parent is facing. Some of them will even help this child get to school, whether it's helping them get a like some are really great and they'll even do like Uber, and they will help the student Uber to school if it's a transportation issue, or give them like a bus card if it's a transportation issue. Some of them are like, I'm going to meet you at school today. So they make sure that they're at school so that that person might bring them lunch or bring them some type of incentive. It's kind of like, I would feel like in the sense of mentoring, but it's more individualized rather than it be like a whole group. And then we also have behavior intervention plans. And so I'm going to go over that today for a child, like based off of a child's IEP. But you can have a behavior intervention plan in the school, in it as a general education student as well. The purpose of the plan is that, for example, you mention a target behavior that the student is having the challenge with, which could be non-compliance, for example. And then it will break down what non-compliance looks like for that student. What are the antecedents to that behavior? When do you see that behavior occur the most? And then how should staff respond? So I always say the behavior intervention plan, even though it has the student's name on it, it's for the staff in that student's life to follow. So the plan is for the adults in that life to, in the child's life, to follow this plan to make sure that we always are responding to that student in a consistent manner. So this is when we're supporting students in special education. So this is a framework that we would generally see students or staff follow when a child has consistent and persistent behaviors that are impacting their education. So in this framework, the child already has an IEP. They're already identified for special education services. So the first criteria is that we want staff to identify what are the concerns. So we always look at what are the students' strengths, because we want to build upon those strengths. And then we want to look at also what are the students' areas of need. So what are the challenging behaviors that we're seeing? Do we, considering the setting, the time, the activities that the behaviors occur? So is it usually at unstructured time? Is it always in the classroom? Is it during the classroom when we're doing math versus reading? Like they like reading, but they don't like math. And then we encourage the team to collect data. So it usually will be the classroom teacher, or sometimes in special education, they have special education aides. So we would use those staff members to collect data consistently for at least 10 days to get a baseline. And once we have a baseline, then we're going to form a meeting where we're going to have the school team consult, where we're going to have team members consult as a team. So we want the person or staff member that collected the data to meet with the educational specialist. So the educational specialist is generally like a special education teacher. And then we have the general education teachers. So if the student, for example, is only with a special education teacher for a period of time where the teacher pushes in maybe for 30 minutes, but they're in a general education class, we want that teacher that sees that student more of the day to also be present to say what they're seeing. And then a school psychologist, because they give support on interventions. If the school is lucky enough to have a BCBA, then we definitely want them on the team, right? Because BCBAs are able to support with behavior analysis and help us identify behavior interventions. And then regarding the related service providers, that's for like students if they have speech, or if they have occupational therapy, if they have physical therapy. It would be any specialized service that the student receives throughout their IEP. And so we want the team to get together to discuss the behavior concerns and develop a plan for interventions. And then we want them to implement those plans for at least 6 to 8 weeks so that they can monitor the students' progress and collect data. So we always want to use data when we're deciding any decision regarding a student, because we need to make sure that our decisions are defensible. So we may be able to say, like, for example, that we're implementing a intervention regarding the students having noncompliance or task avoidance because over the last 10 days they haven't completed one writing task, because in multiple classes they continue to refuse to complete the writing task. And then regarding the additional supports, so once we have a team plan and we've implemented the plan for 6 to 8 weeks, we want the team to get back together so that they can talk about the students' progress. But we also want them to consider, in IEPs, we can have behavior specific goals. So the goal could be a goal regarding if the child's non-compliant or with writing tasks, we might want to write a goal about either their completion about writing tasks, or we want to write a goal about their non-compliance. Because when we have a goal in the IEP regarding the specific topic, the expectation is that the staff that are in that child's educational setting are all working towards that same goal. So it's more of an accountability piece, but also the expectation is that we're teaching the replacement behaviors that we want to see demonstrated. So it also holds more focus on that area of concern, because we will be working on it as an IEP team. And so then you want to review if there's also any accommodations that needed to be added to the IEP that might alleviate or decrease that challenging behavior. So if I give the example of writing tasks, is it the physical action of writing, or would the child really prefer to type? So if they rather than writing, we can add an accommodation that written tasks could be typed versus written, and that would be in that child's IEP. So every single written task could be typed if it's like an essay, for example. So those are the things that the IEP team has the ability to add in a child's IEP that might better support with some of these challenges, or with some of the antecedents, right, to the challenging behavior. And then we want to monitor the student's progress and continue with monitoring to determine if any additional changes might be needed. If the student continues to persist with challenging behaviors, whether it's aggression, if they're hitting, if they're kicking, but we're seeing it daily, our interventions we tried, it really isn't working, then what we would consider is looking at the progress the child's made towards that IEP goal. And then we would consult with the school psychologist. Some districts, the school psychologist is the one that will complete what's called a functional behavior assessment. It could be the BCBA. It really just depends on the district. So then we would want the staff members to complete what's called an FBA so that we can better determine what are we seeing, or what's the function of these behaviors that we're seeing. So as part of the FBA, they're determining the setting, the behaviors where they're occurring the most, what activities that do we see the behaviors occur, and then we're also providing recommendations, what should be included in the IEP or included in the child's educational setting that would address those behaviors. And so in special education, in order to complete an FBA, we need parents to sign an assessment plan so we have the permission to complete it. They get 60 days to complete the assessment plan from the time that they receive the assessment plan back. And then once we have received or completed the FBA, the teams usually create what I mentioned earlier is called the Behavior Intervention Plan, or a BIP. So can you guys still see my screen? And do you now see a sample behavior intervention plan? Is that what you see, Sunny? Yeah, okay, good. I try to download everything ahead of time so it'd be easier to go through the pages. So this is an example of an FBA. I was going to see if I can, and so it's a fake student, we made it up, but this one focuses on non-compliance. And so it's the student's refusal to comply with an adult request or task or demand by verbal redirection, so saying no, or lack of responding by just staring at the adult and not initiating the request. So the purpose of this plan is to first identify what is the behavior impeding the learning, but we want to put it in a manner that's observable and measurable. So for example, if I'm saying the child's non-compliant, I want to describe it in a way that every adult would know what noncompliance looks like so that we would have consistency in how we're describing it or observing it. And then they're going to identify the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of how often these behaviors are occurring. So when we are looking at the plan, we want to talk about also the environmental factors and what do we think is causing the behavior. So with as part of the FBA, you should have an idea of like one of the are the antecedents based off your data collection. So what happened first before this child always or ever did that behavior. So sometimes it could be a non-preferred task. It could be the task is too long. They were denied access to preferred activity or an item. So those are the common antecedents that we see. Then we also are asking staff members to identify the environmental structure or supports that are needed in the educational setting to reduce the problem behavior. So it might be that the child needs non-contingent breaks, which are breaks that they'll just get without having to do anything. They don't have to earn it. They just get that break, and it could be a break once a period for 2 minutes. It doesn't even have to be a long break. The staff should also identify if the break should be in class, should it be out of class, should it be at their desk, or should it be in a calm area in the back of the room. So then for example, if you came to my school and I gave you John's plan, you would know exactly what to do if you were like subbing in that class that day, or if you were John's aide that day. The plan should be so easily or so clearly defined, so every staff member should know how to implement it. And then based off of the FBA, you would determine what was the function of the behaviors. And so, for example, this one was escape. And it was non-compliant behaviors appeared to be maintained by escaping non-preferred tasks or situations. And then we want to talk about what is the replacement behavior? So what would we like the student to do in place of having non-compliant behaviors? So you would write an IEP goal for that, which I was mentioning would be in the IEP. So this goal is by August 2025, which already passed, but when given one verbal prompt, John will engage in functional communication to appropriately escape, avoid, or delay a non-preferred activity, task, or demand instead of engaging in non-compliant behaviors, and 70% of opportunities across 2 consecutive weeks. So the teachers, whoever is assigned to this goal, will be responsible for collecting data to determine if the child met this goal or not. And then we also need to figure out what are teaching strategies. So for example, the goal required the student to use functional communication, but does the student know how to do functional communication? So then that might be something that we would need to teach the student, for example, on how to request or how to request a break or saying they need additional time. So for example, if the student is not able to orally use or ask for a break, could we have a break card on their desk? So when they need a break, they can pull out the break card. We can have the break card tapped to their desk. They could just tap it. It could be that they could just have a popsicle stick, and every time they need a break, they just hang it, and the teacher can just visually see and say, okay, you've got 5 minutes, I'll start the timer. So some way for the child to be able to communicate their needs and in a manner that they feel confident in, but also a manner they feel comfortable in being able to communicate. And then the student, we talked about providing choices. And then lastly, when a list, sorry, not lastly, but another section, we want to talk about the reinforcers. So what do we need to establish the behavior? What do we need to maintain the behavior, and then help the student generalize this skills to other settings. So that also should be clearly identified. And then how are we going to select the reinforcers? Generally, we try to do some type of reinforcer survey. We also will talk to parents and get parent input on like what are some of the things. Whenever you can include parents, I strongly recommend it, because sometimes if they have a really good day at home, the parents might be willing to like take them to their favorite, like get them McDonald's after school, or on Fridays take them to Yogurtland. And that really matters when we're able to build those connections between school and home, because it just makes a stronger connection between your day at school mattering and having importance than when you go home. So for example, if the student had a bad day at school and just, demonstrated just poor decisions in regards to like following directions and wasn't following the teacher and wasn't listening to directions, it was defiant, maybe they were cursing at the teacher or hitting the teacher and kicking, but then they got home and they got to be on their iPad the whole day, that really doesn't give the teacher much weight in being able to intervene on those behaviors. But they're like, once I leave here, I go have a great day at home. And so that's why I also think it's so important with working with parents, because they're able to partner with you so that you would be able to have more control over the reinforcers, but they also do too, so that they learn that their decisions at school matter at home, and their decisions, it's the same way if a parent telling you they had a rough day at home, they want to tell you at school because they're like, oh, home today, he might have a bad day at school because he had a rough morning. And I think it's important that we're communicating both ways. And then on the last part of the behavior plan, it talks about how we would describe or what we would see if the students in the early stages of like an escalation of the behaviors. So that's like if you ever saw a de-escalation cycle where it goes like kind of like a little curve, the student would be at the very beginning of the escalation cycle, and we would want to describe like what are they doing first, so that you might see inattention, they're not responding to instructions, they might be gazing at the teacher, and then how do we want the staff to respond? So rather than before this child really fully reaches some type of point of escalation, we might want to try to lessen our verbal demands. We might want to try using first in, letting the student know that they can complete their work and then they can get a break. You might even want to change the demand and say, instead of doing 10 problems, just start doing 5, so that you're trying to intervene before the problem behavior can increase. And if the student does reach when the student is currently displaying problem behaviors, you would just see continued refusal, might see disruptive behavior such as calling out, and then how do we want the staff to respond? So we want the staff to provide reinforcement for any use of functional behavior. So if you see them doing anything that might be positive, you want to compliment it and you want to praise it. You want to be able to prompt the student to give them a break and give them space, or give them the choice, right? Do you want a break? Or do you want to read a book in like privately? Just trying to give them choices, especially choices that that they might that are preferred for them before the behavior can escalate. And if the student has engaged in the problem behavior and they're on their way of de-escalating, sometimes if a student, for example, the ones that have really big feelings and emotions, and we have students that really will flip desk and throw everything and rip everything off the walls, and once they're calming down, sometimes we see those students, they're very tired, they're lethargic, they're crying, and so we just kind of know that that's what are those signs that we're looking for when they're about to de-escalate, and then how should staff respond so that we are not going to re-trigger the student, so that we're going back through that escalation cycle. So then those are the times that we might provide this child more space. We might provide additional choices that might be more appropriate. We want to redirect the student back to the activity if they're ready to engage, or ask them if they want to try a different activity. And then for the students' behaviors after the cycle, that's when we want to look at ways that we could talk to the student to either debrief the situation. They might try to have a conversation if the student is ready to talk about like what could they do next time. If the student is upset still, or has the ability, or you feel like they could get re-triggered, you might want to have that conversation towards the end of the day rather than right after the incident. It really depends on the child and the student's needs, but I think that's always something that we want to have that opportunity to talk with the student, especially if they're old enough to, and they have the ability to communicate, because we want to be able to see if there's anything also in our plan that we were doing that the student didn't like. Because I feel like, especially if you get to work with like middle school age or upper elementary and high school, having that ability to communicate with the student to say, well, what did you feel like you needed? And the student's like, well, I needed a break. It's like, okay, well, how can if you feel like you couldn't ask for a break, what can I do to help you with that? Or do you want to make some type of system where you and I can communicate, and then I'll know for sure you need a break? Those are things that we could try to attempt through that piece of the post-incident. And then based off of the back to the modifying support. So say, for example, if the student already has a BIP we would adjust the BIP if we needed to. And then we could also, if the student wasn't making progress to the behavior goal, we could revise the goal if we needed. Revising the goal can also include us maybe offering more additional supports to the goal. So for example, I think the goal that I wrote, the student needed one prompt, but maybe they need more than one prompt to be able to request a break. Maybe they need a visual prompt. Maybe we need to provide some folder in there or like a task band, and you're like, this is your coping strategies box. And every time you feel escalated, you would go in this box and you can pick activities from it. There's different things that we can incorporate so that we can ensure that it's the student has better access to the supports that they need. Okay. And so the last section, we're going to talk about collaboration. So as I shared before, working in a team when you're addressing problem behaviors is so important because we really do want to be able to depend on one another. Being the only person can lead to burnout, but also I think we all bring different lenses of expertise that we can build upon to best support students. So I would think about, if you work at schools or if you work at a clinic, I just want to encourage you to think about how do your current teams that you work on, whether it's at work or whether it's in a clinic, like I said, how do you guys work together to support student behavior? Is there anything you guys do specifically?
You guys can put it in the chat. Otherwise, I can kind of share what we do
Mhm.
to work together to support student behavior. I
Yeah.
would say the hardest thing, Ashley, I mean, you've done such a great job with sharing so much information. I would say the hardest thing is probably getting the adults on
Yeah.
board, getting the
That's true.
adults to try the strategies,
Mhm.
follow it for 6 to 8 weeks, and trust the process.
Yeah.
And then I think the second hardest thing would be, I mean, again, like I've worked with so many families and everyone comes from such different background. And I have some parents that are fantastic, and I have some, caregivers that are super on board, and then I have the complete opposite. So I think just that consistency, it has been the hardest. But I would say probably the best thing that I and my team has done is just, if we can't control all of those variables, at least then we can be that consistent support person,
Yeah.
like what you mentioned early on, right? Like, does a student, especially if a student comes from a traumatic background, like, does a student have a trusted adult? And so yeah, someone shared that our team works together by communicating daily, sharing data, and using consistent behavior strategies to support each student's progress. I work in a clinical setting and we are all, let's see, um, clinical setting and we all work together. It's an amazing setting. Work in the home, but I try to attend IEP meetings when possible.
Good. Yeah. And I think even if you work at a clinic and you contribute to attending IEP meetings, that's amazing. Like one of my, I love collaborating with ABA providers that are in the home setting and inviting them to any meetings that we have at school, because you see the child in a different setting, but you might be doing strategies that that student is usually used to, that they respond better to. And so we try to work together to collaborate, even when we're making behavior plans in the school setting. We will encourage them to give us advice or give us some tools that they might be working on. And if they're making a behavior plan for the home, they might ask us the same, like, what are some things that you're doing for reinforcement? What are some things where you're doing when you're presenting tasks or demands in a certain manner, so that we could do the same? And so I really feel like we shouldn't be working in isolation, because we, like I said before, we have so much expertise, all of us within ourselves, that we can contribute to the success of the student. So so the first step is, like, we want to create these collaborative teams, right? So we want to know, who are our players, who should we have on our team? And so in the school setting, we always want to include administrators, because we want to make sure that they are there to support with facilitating the intervention process and enforcing expectations. So like Sunny was sharing, sometimes working with adults is not always the funnest thing. Some part that you don't enjoy most about your job, because they all have their own ideas of how things should work, and they may stray from the plan. They they might not be bought into the plan and just don't want to do it. So as an administrator, as an instructional leader of that site, they would support with the implementation piece and making sure everyone is doing their part. If someone is not doing their part, then they would be able to have a conversation with that person. And then general education teachers, so they support with like the grade level expectations and content and skills. So sometimes we have students that are in special education and they're not with their grade level peers for academic content, but the general education teacher would be a really good I guess support or someone to give advice on what should a child in second grade be learning right now, or at October, or sorry, we're in November. So November, so in this time of the school year, what would the second grader be learning? What should they already have mastered since from August to November? And they'll give us insight on that so we can have an idea of like the content skills that we should be working towards to close that gap. Special education educators are really good because they have a lot of insight on accommodations, right? So how do we accommodate work so that we can make it more manageable for students? Even regarding behaviors, they work with a lot of students that have behavior needs, so they might also have input on behavioral strategies or even how to present tasks so that they're more manageable for students. And like I said, with related service providers, that could be speech and language pathologists, school psychologists, school social workers, or counselors, and they'll support the communication, academics, and behavioral social emotional needs of students. I like to work with our school psychologists, so as our speech pathologists, because they're really helpful in helping students. If we're saying, for example, the student's struggling with asking for help, they would be able to support us with like how are ways that we can build that communication piece. The speech pathologists I work with now are really great at making communication core boards. So for example, if the student needs to request a break, go to the bathroom, a preferred activity, they'll make these picture icon boards that we will tape on the student's desk, and all they have to do is point to what they need. And so they're really good at that. They also sometimes run social skills groups, so do social workers and school counselors, but speech pathologists do, in helping students have sentence frames, right? So if you're going to walk up to a new group of students, how do you greet them? How do you communicate if you're feeling upset? And they could give them a sentence frame of, I feel this. They help even with like identifying emotions. So I think in the school setting, a lot of our roles sometimes overlap, which is really great. So then you also know who's working on what. So then you don't have to target that specifically, but you can target another skill with that student. And then for BCBAs, they support students and staff with addressing behavioral needs and behavior analysis, developing the intervention plans, figuring out reinforcement surveys. They're just like a wealth of knowledge. And so I think it's just really great if schools are fortunate to have one, or districts are, to pull them in to kind of help with even the data collection piece, to be able to feel like even helping teachers develop data sheets or providing data sheets that are, because sometimes the teacher is like, well, I'm teaching, I can't do it. But they might be able to help you develop a data collection system that could work with you, even with your teaching. Maybe it's something where you're not collecting data every single frequency, but it can be some type of, oh, sorry. Oh, I thought that was you, but someone else, I think. Maybe
Yes, there
Sunny.
you go.
Okay. And
You're back. You're back.
okay, sorry, was I frozen?
Yes.
Can you, oh,
Nope, you're
sorry.
good
Okay, sorry guys. So I was talking about BCBAs, just saying how they're great and wonderful with collecting behavior information. And then for parents, like I said, I always invite parent input because they can just give input on like parent reinforcers that the student likes. They'll help reinforce with the behavior progress that you're doing. They will help with expectations in the home setting, and then the homeschool collaboration. I just think it's important for students to know that you talk to their parents, that their parents are aware of how they are doing at school, and you're aware of how they're doing at home. It's kind of like mom and dad. You can't trick mom and dad if mom and dad are both talking to each other. And so I think that's really great that there is communication between both parties. And then the collaborative team approach, you just want to make sure that all team members understand their roles and responsibilities in implementing the intervention. Does one team member need training on a specific topic of the intervention plan? Or do they need ongoing support for implementing any specific strategy? That's something that you would do when you have these team meetings. And you want to make sure that you're meeting regularly to discuss progress, challenges, and needed modifications. Even when students have like these really big behaviors, practice. Like for example, if a student is having a behavior that it required like 15 or maybe like I would say like 5 team members and they all had to come and try to de-escalate the student. We always forget because we're just like, okay, that behavior was done and thank God. And like, can I go home now? But it's important that we sit together and debrief to say, how did I respond to that student? Is there things that I could change? Could I do something differently? And so I think that's a piece that we forget to do in schools is the debriefing piece, but it's really important so that we could talk about how we can make adjustments to any plans that we have in place if some parts are not working, especially as students reinforcers change, like just like your interests and your needs change, theirs can as well. And so then maybe we're like, okay, that reinforcer is not really working for me in my class anymore, but maybe it's working in another class. And so like, or what are you doing? How do you present it? So then you can just like talk with different staff members so that you guys can all get input on how to even present the reinforcers. You want to maintain clear communication channels between team members throughout the process. And then when appropriate, also collaborate with community-based service providers to build consistency and continuity of care. And I think that also goes to like if the student has an outside therapist, you want to include them in the meetings when appropriate and when possible. If the student has an ABA therapist, you want to bring them in too as well to talk about what strategies are being implemented in the home or the community setting. And then just the importance of collaboration. So shared expertise leads to stronger support plans. So each team member brings their own unique insights. It could be regardless of the role. They all contribute towards developing a plan that addresses the whole child. So like I said, if the student has, the teacher might be focused on academics, but if a student has sensory needs, I might want to include the occupational therapist because they can give strategies for if the student needs anything to help regulate their sensory needs in that classroom. The behaviorist might be focusing on the behavior plan and strategies, whereas the school psychologist will be there to see if there's any accommodations for the academic task. So each person's bringing their own unique lens, but each person is addressing some type of need that the student is displaying. And then with consistency across settings is very critical for a plan to be successful, for a student to have more success with an intervention plan that's in place. We all have to be consistent. So when all adults respond to a behavior in a unified way, students receive clear and predictable support that strengthens the success of the intervention plan. And then also collaborative teams reduce educator burnout. So just thinking about the work that you're doing, even if you're not in schools, but when you know that you have a team that you can rely on and that you can count on, when the support is shared, staff feel less isolated and more equipped to manage challenging behaviors because you know that you have someone that can just tap you in, tap you out, especially if you're having a really hard day. You want to be able to lean on others. And so I just think that's just like so important in the work of schools when we're addressing challenging behaviors. And so in summary, we just want to make sure that we have an understanding of the why behind the behaviors that the student is doing, because it's really essential in how we respond and organize our supports. When we have systematic data-driven approaches, it leads to more effective interventions and long-term student growth. And then when teams collaborate, students benefit from consistent and holistic support. So that's all that I had to share today. But do you guys have any questions for me?
This was very thought out, Ashley. I know for me, like I know working with challenging students can be hard, but at the end of the day, I always tell people like no student wakes up saying like I'm gonna be so disruptive today. I'm gonna
Yeah.
go and go hit my teacher or I'm gonna go and punch my friend in the like I don't think any kid wakes up with those
Yeah.
thoughts.
Hmm.
I think having that perspective makes a difference. And Ashley, you're so right about, those talks that teachers have. There's a kinder teacher I'm working with, and like she's just like, oh, he's so aggressive, and just
Yes.
having those types of statements. We're already like pigeonholing the student into a teacher
Hmm.
category. So
Yeah, and then you start believing, those things that are said about you when it's so far from the truth. Because even when you said, I don't think any child like comes to school like I want to have a bad day. Like I admire the staff every day that can have like a really hard day with a student and every day is a fresh start and they meet them with a hug and a smile. Because we also don't realize how much effort it takes to like be in a behavior for that amount of time. That's why I'm like they go to sleep or they're like crying because like your body's like physically releasing all the tension that you feel from that like behavior cycle.
and then I think also the other piece too, I know some of you guys work in a home setting, some of you guys work in a clinical setting. If you do get a chance to collaborate with the school team, I think also oftentimes like students have challenging behaviors because there's not the proper support or
Yes.
proper training provided to the staff. And so, that's like a whole nother webinar,
Yes.
but it can also be like, again, we can control what we can control, but it can also be like a systemic issue in terms of training needs and things like that. So
Yeah, especially if you meet and work in a clinic, don't hesitate to ever say, like, can I talk to the teacher? We have districts all have like a release of information form that parents can sign so that you can collaborate with the school team. And I really would say like every teacher, staff member is just so eager to have collaboration.
and I think it's I always, if you work with parents, I always have, I always tell parents, hey, I'm happy to attend the IEP meeting. You just have to and when I share that with parents, they're like, oh my gosh, like we would love for you to attend the IEP meeting. We didn't know. Because
Mhm.
parents have a right to invite whoever they want.
Whoever they want, they can.
So if you're a BCBA working with parents, whether it's in a clinical or home setting outside of the school setting, offer to help attend the IEP meeting. And that makes such a difference to a lot of the families.
And you
Um,
can also come observe, just so you guys know too. Like if you ever want to just observe the student at school with the release of information, you can always request that too, and the parents give permission. And it's really cool to see your students in a different setting and see how they are outside of the home or the clinic.
Absolutely. We got how can school teams ensure that interventions for challenging behaviors don't inadvertently stigmatize students or harm peer relationships?
That's a good question. I think it's about how you frame the correction. So rather than like I always say, like speak what you want to see, right? Rather than say, no, stop, don't do that. You would say, like, for example, like we tell the students like have calm hands, especially if you are able to like state it in a positive manner, like hands to yourself. But then it should be also the directions or the comment that you're asking the student to do stated to the whole class. Like they hear it, even if it's not like John, do this. You can say, class, I want everyone to be sitting and listening. And then I really like the classes that have incentives for the whole class. So for example, if everyone has a good day, then they can earn like a pizza party or they can earn like free time on the computer. So you want to make sure that you can include as many people in the intervention plan as possible. So rather than it be so individualized to the student, sometimes they do need that. But when it comes to like classroom expectations and classroom supports, it could be a whole class thing. So we tell teachers, like some teachers collect like little marbles and every child can get it and then they earn something. I think it's important that they see that student that has the problem behaviors helping the class earn something positive. So I probably would token or give that child more marbles for like the littlest of things so then they are earning it more and then like everyone thinks they're doing such a great job too. It's how you single them out, but if you include them in the positives that you're doing, I really feel like that's more helpful.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for attending. I will be sending out an email, a follow-up email, and if you guys are wanting CEUs, whether it's for your BCBA, BCABA, for QBA, QASPS, please complete the form, and I will be sending those out in a few weeks. Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of your week.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.